Welcome, everyone. Thank you to all of you who are joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn, Protecting Maine's Trails and Outdoor Spaces, and a look at the Maine Trails Bond. And thank you to everyone who is watching the recording. When we scheduled this program, we thought we would still be on pins and needles waiting for the final results of an incredibly high stakes presidential election. Maggie and I imagined spending this lunch and learn hour, which you have often heard us say is our favorite part of the week every week, with all of you abuzz with anxiety and optimism that our country would finally and firmly shut the door on the Trump era. Alas, there were bright spots on Tuesday here in Maine and across the country, but we won't sugarcoat it. The federal election results are devastating. With every bit of ourselves, we wanted more for the climate, for our democracy, for the woods, waters, and wildlife. Next week, we will use this space to dig into the election results and what they mean for the work ahead. We'll be pushing back where we need to. We'll be using every opportunity we have to make progress. And we'll be learning the lessons from this week's elections for a long time. We have to. But today, we're going to focus on the overwhelming success of the $30 million Trails Bond and the remarkable statewide coalition that rallied in support of this initiative. Our friends at the Natural Resources Council of Maine worked closely with communities and organizations and people across this state to pass the Trails Bond and to solidify Maine's position as a national leader in outdoor recreation that supports local economic growth and expands access for all users. I wasn't sure whether we'd all be up for this program this week, but boy, is it good to be with all of you to focus on something so positive. We are absolutely thrilled to welcome Josh Caldwell, who is NRCM's Climate and Clean Energy Manager, and Bronya Lechtman, Grassroots Outreach Manager, for a behind-the-scenes look at the Trails Bond campaign and an early analysis of what it all means. My name is Kathleen Meal. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to building a just, thriving future for all by acting on the climate crisis, protecting the environment, and safeguarding our democracy. MCV does that by bringing people and organizations together to educate, inspire, and advocate. And MCV by advocating for equitable policies, holding elected officials accountable, and winning elections. We don't always win all of them, but we win some really important ones. Since 2020, we have spent this weekly online lunch and learn time together, digging into all of those goals. We are so grateful to all of you for being with us. Few logistics before we dive in. Josh and Bronya are going to give us their insights first, and then we will tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. As always, you can send questions to me or to Maggie through the chat, and we'll keep track of them. We ask that you not message Josh and Bronya directly. We want them to be able to focus on the presentation. And as always, Maggie is the one to help you out with any technical difficulties. This event is being recorded. The video will be posted on our website later this afternoon. You can also find recordings of all of our previous programs on YouTube, and you can feel free to share this and the follow-up email you get later today far and wide. Thank you so much. Josh and Bronya, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. I'll share my screen in a second here so we can get started, but I just wanted to say I really appreciate you having us on and appreciate that table setting. In moments like these, I'm particularly reminded of the power of local organizing and statewide organizing, and I think that this Trails Bond victory is really exemplary of a long-term organizing strategy that really paid off and has resulted in the only trails bond in Maine's history and the largest investment in Maine trails ever, which is something that we really should be celebrating and that we will be reaping the benefits of for years to come. Also, I'm calling in today from Maine Audubon's office, which is another good example of our cross-environmental collaboration. So it's really good to be here. Bronya, I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, hi everyone. Really appreciate you all being here today. And I echo a lot of what's already been said. And glad to just be able to talk about something exciting right now. But I'm Bronya Lechtman. I'm the Grassroots Outreach Manager at NRCM. I'll pass it back to you, Josh.
Thanks, Bronya. Can you all see my screen now? It's worked. That's always the most nerve-wracking part. Now we can actually talk about the trails bond. So just to give you a little bit of background, this has been a long organizing effort that spanned a couple of years. So I'm going to start by giving you some of the highlights about what the trails bond actually is and what it will accomplish for Maine these coming years. And then I'll go back in time and take you through some of the process that it took to get to the place that we are today. And then Bronya will take us home with kind of the last final electoral push and some of the next steps for the Trails Bond moving forward. So with that, I'll jump to the next slide. So as I mentioned in the preview, this is the first ever Trails Bond. It's $30 million. Almost all of that is going to go directly to trails projects, which is really exciting. $7.5 million per year over the next 4 years. It is managed by the Bureau of Parks and Lands, and that is the organization that executes the annual Recreational Trails Program, or RTP. So they're an entity that is familiar with accepting funding and then distributing it out to local trails groups to do these trails projects. And that's really wonderful to have that allyship with them. It's grants for non-motorized, motorized, and diverse use. 25% each for explicitly motorized, explicitly non-motorized, and then 50% for diverse use trails. And it requires a 10% match from applying entities. So if you are a municipality or a trails group or a nonprofit, and you're applying for a trails project to either maintain or build a new trail, you're required to provide 10% match. We had initially started out thinking that a 20% match would make sense, but to leverage some more funding from local communities, but found that that might be a barrier for some communities to engage. So we reduced it to a 10% match that can also be met in kind. So either through tools or volunteer service, you can meet that match. So I just want to pause here and note that this is really exciting. It's the first time this has ever happened in Maine, and it really reaffirms to us that trails are indeed infrastructure here in Maine and that they deserve to be invested in. This trails bond can be put toward a really diverse array of trails, as you can see on your screen right now, ranging from snowmobile trails to hiking trails, multimodal paths, trails that connect urban areas, trails that connect rural areas. So we're really excited to see it go out the door. The way it's going to work, and we can get into that in a little bit, is basically that like over the next 4 years, each year $7.5 million will be made available. You can apply for a project up to $250,000. And then you can go back and apply again the next year if you'd like. But it can either be used for trail maintenance or for building new trails. So we'll get into that here. We really need trails funding. And this kind of arose, the idea for the Trails Bond arose out of the need that was evident here in Maine. Over the pandemic, we've seen record levels of use on trails, which is a really, in some ways, wonderful outcome. People are getting outside and enjoying nature and really taking advantage of the natural beauty that Maine has to offer. But it also means that trails are getting eroded by more regular use. And that's happening simultaneously with the impacts of climate change, right? So we know that trails are increasingly seeing the impacts of the increased precipitation events and the large storms that we've seen over the past few years. And so there's a large need for maintenance. We also know that we need greater accessibility to the outdoors via trails in particular, and we worked hard to ensure that this Trails Bond is going to prioritize trails that are accessible, which is really wonderful. I noted a little bit on the previous slide that Maine invests very little in trails, but what this actually looks like is a little bit under $1 million through the Recreational Trails Program per year, which is really not enough to even address the maintenance backlog, let alone thinking about more creative trails projects and uses. So $7.5 million per year for the next 4 years is really a huge increase. And hopefully we'll set a precedent for continued trails funding into the future once we see some of these projects underway. One stat that I just wanted to share with all of you is that every dollar invested in trails leads to $3 in positive health outcomes. So we know that trails are really economically beneficial. They're really beneficial for people's health. Basically, the return on investment for trails is really huge. So here's a few pictures that I just wanted to share. This is a little bit of a downer slide, but it really evidences the extent to which the storms in January and February had a big impact on trails throughout the state. So you can see here from bridges to the actual trails themselves, the erosional capacity of water is pretty incredible, and we're seeing really high precipitation events, particularly in the winter. And so I think a critical need that will come out of this trail bond, and what a lot of groups are going to use this trail bond for, is trail maintenance to repair a lot of the damage that occurred. But we also know that there's a lot of opportunities for new trails. There are groups around the state that already have really good ideas for trail systems. I'm thinking of the new Rumford Town Forest, a 400-acre segment that was just purchased. They're going to need a trail network to ensure that is used to the best recreational capacity possible. There's a lot of other examples of projects out there, and I think that the format of the Trails Bond and the way that it's distributed really values local input, right? So trails groups that are based in areas in Maine have a good idea. The obstacle to enacting that idea historically has been lack of access to funding, and this Trails Bond is now going to unlock those new trails ideas, which is really exciting, and leads to a huge economic generation for Maine, and that's what this slide speaks to. So Maine is in the top 5 in terms of states for the percentage of our GDP that comes from outdoor recreation. Nearly 4% of Maine's annual GDP comes directly from outdoor recreation, and you can see that that's on par with states the likes of Wyoming, even greater than Colorado, Montana, right? These states that we think of for their great outdoor access and economics associated with it. That looks like around $3.3 billion in Maine's GDP every year, which is a really huge number relative to Maine's annual economy, and is really critical to sustain any number of businesses, from outdoor outfitters to hospitality businesses to food businesses throughout the state that really rely on visitation due to Maine's incredible outdoor beauty. It also looks like 32,000 jobs throughout the state of Maine in the outdoor recreation industry, which is really irreplaceable. And this Trails Bond, I think, is going to grow that number for sure. We've also been partnering closely with Maine Outdoor Brands, and they've given us some insights into what it means for the retailers that outfit Maine's outdoor community. It looks like $271 million in manufacturing and $850 million annually in retail sales. So this just really underscores that Maine's outdoor recreation economy is a really powerful economic engine, and the Trails Bond, I think, will facilitate that moving forward. So that's a little bit of background on what the Trails Bond is and what we think it's going to do for Maine. And I want us all to be really excited about that. So I hope that you're in the same boat that I am. I also want to give a lot of applause, commendation to the process by which we got here. And I think it's important to focus on process, because this was really an exemplary effort of organizing across the state of Maine, and truly all across the state of Maine. This arose out of a listening session that NRCM facilitated in Farmington. We went out to Farmington to meet with local trails groups, landowners, and nonprofits and small business owners to communicate with them, what is it that their primary needs are? How can the Natural Resources Council of Maine facilitate those needs? And we were a little bit surprised to hear that trails were really a priority cross-sectorally. The people in this community were really looking for more access to the outdoors, and more sustainable access to the outdoors to facilitate the economy, and also just to facilitate their ability, in Farmington, Maine, to appreciate what a beautiful place they live in. So from this listening session, we developed this concept of a Trails Bond, and we felt that a bond would be a powerful tool to move forward trails funding. Maine has passed 8 transportation bonds since 2013, and all of those have been $90 to $110 million to reinforce our transportation infrastructure. And we really wanted to reinforce that trails are a backbone of Maine's economy, society, and culture. And we can only reaffirm that through dedicated funding. So we put forward a bond, knowing that it was probably going to be a long shot, but that we had some support from people in really critical areas of the state. Our sponsor, Jess Raymond, was really phenomenal and partnered across the aisle with Republicans such as Senator Russell Black, who have been really phenomenal champions for trails funding. And we'll get into a little bit here how bipartisan this effort ultimately was. So here's one of our primary tactics was really to bring people from around the state in to talk to their state legislators. Here in Maine, we are really benefited by the fact that our state house is eminently accessible. You know, you can go and find your legislators in the state house, communicate the importance of trails or any other issue that you're working on to them. And we assembled a really phenomenal group of people from a bunch of different sectors to come and talk to legislators. And I'll give you a little cross-section of you know, some of those folks in a couple of slides here. But it was so we introduced this at the beginning of the 131st legislative session. It took that full legislative session and then the year following before we finally got passage at the very end of 2023 or 2024. My goodness, it was a very quick turnaround between when we actually passed this bond and when it was voted on. But it was basically a 2-year legislative effort with continued communication from constituents to their legislators. And then ultimately we brought in 9 folks from a bunch of different sectors who could speak really specifically to how the Trails Bond would benefit them. And they each provided testimony to the Appropriations Committee to really reinforce that this bond was a critical need for them and their community. We also had a dedicated Trails Day at the State House, and it was really phenomenal to hold this. All of these folks pictured here came to the State House from literally all across the state, and I'll show you a map in a second how varied these voices emerged from. But to talk to their legislators in one day about the importance of the Trails Bond. They're all wearing Trails Bond stickers. And I think this mass show of power, in addition to the one-on-ones and the grassroots organizing we did, combined to come to a really phenomenal outcome. But just so you can get a sense here, we have bicyclist groups, we have snowmobile groups, we have ATV groups, we have the Appalachian Mountain Club and folks that are more oriented on hiking. We have the Portland Trails Coalition, so folks that are more oriented on urban trails. This really represented a pretty diverse array of people who are excited about trails for a lot of different reasons. And I think we really evidenced that to legislators on this day in particular, that this was a diverse effort that could bring in a lot of voices around a concept that people could agree on across the aisle. What emerged throughout the course of our organizing was a sign-on letter that included 520 organizations, businesses, and towns supporting the Trails Bond. I won't say that this is unprecedented, but I will say that for NRCM, this is not something we've ever been able to accomplish before. This is a ton of people on a single letter saying that we need investment in our trails. And you can see here on the map on your screen, a representation of where these sign-ons came from. I won't read all of these quotes, but I do just want to give you a sense of the diversity of voices that spoke to the need for trails in their states. Ranging from Maine Outdoor Brands, focusing on retail, the president of ATV Maine, Brent West, who is a really key ally for us with the High Peaks Alliance out in Franklin County, Angie Arno, who is the executive director of the Piscataquis County on economic development, Al Sweat, the president of the Maine Snowmobile Association, and the final two, George O'Keefe, the Rumford town manager, and Gabe Perkins, the executive director of Inland Woods and Trails. I think this is a really good example of the diverse array of voices that spoke to the need for this Trails Bond. And it wasn't easy. I think the easy part was talking to people about the value of trails. The hard part was convincing people that $30 million was a worthwhile investment for our state. And we did that in a lot of ways. We did that evidence-based, but I think that really the strongest thing that we did was form a bunch of relationships that resulted in resounding support for trails funding as a concept. And what that ultimately resulted in was overwhelming support for the Trails Bond. we've never seen bipartisanship to this extent, and that's not an exaggeration. The Senate voted in favor of the bond 29-3, and the House 133-6. We know, and it has been evidenced by recent elections, that we are living in an increasingly partisan world. And yet this was really something that bridged that divide and brought people together across the aisle in a truly unprecedented way. The House vote in particular just blew us out of the water. I mean, we were so excited at this moment. And basically, this happened in the spring of 2024. And, it was a pretty quick turnaround to get this bond on the ballot so that it could be approved as a referendum by Maine voters. But the legislature had to first indicate that was something that they approved of. And I should note here, this is overwhelming support, as you can see, but any bond issue has to be approved by 2/3 of the House and Senate in Maine. So it was a high bar to begin with. And we weren't sure at many points in this campaign that was going to be something that we were able to accomplish. And we really blew it out of the water. So I think that's a testament to the organizing that really grows on itself, right? NRCM reached out to a lot of folks, but then in kind of a spider web or a snowflake model, all those folks were talking to their communities about the value of a trails bond. And I think we, got to an array of legislators in a way that we haven't been able to do on previous topics. We did it in a lot of ways. On the left-hand side, you see Gabe Perkins and George O'Keefe, two of the folks who were featured previously on the quote slide. I'm speaking about the Trails Bond at a press conference at the State House that was really well attended. We got a lot of media attention on the Trails Bond in addition to direct conversations with legislators. And then on the right, you can see Governor Mills surrounded by a coalition of trails advocates signing the Trails Bond into law so that it would be placed on the ballot this year. With that, I will hand it over to Bronya to tell us a little bit more about the process that took place after we were able to successfully pass this in the state legislature.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. So as Josh was explaining, this was a huge coalition of organizations, businesses, municipalities. So I wanted to talk a little bit of just like how was this campaign structured over the last few months. So to be on the ballot, we needed to form a ballot question committee so that we could file the question to the Ethics Commission. So we had this group that you can see on this slide of organizations that were part of the executive committee. And that included NRCM, but also the Nature Conservancy and the Maine Snowmobile Association and Maine Trails Coalition. So the leadership of this campaign was a pretty diverse group of people, which was awesome. From there, so we had this, ballot question committee that was doing some thinking around the overall campaign, but and we also pulled in a few other folks to help with some of that overall strategy. I want to especially highlight Enoch Glidden from Beyond the Fence and then Matt from Luneco Land Trust, who we also pulled in to really help us develop our outreach strategy in particular. Josh, actually, if you could go to the next slide, that'd be great. We also really wanted to use this opportunity to both think about a strategy on the state level and how are we going to get enough votes on the state, how are we going to get enough votes to get this over the finish line, but also the heart of this campaign has been the relationships that we've been able to develop that were really new and something we wanted to keep working on. So to keep that going, we also prioritized a few local areas where we wanted to hold strategy sessions in and make sure that we were spending time to really deepen relationships there and develop and work with leaders out there. So we had strategy sessions in Kingfield and Skowhegan. Kingfield, I also just want to remind everyone too that the Trails Bond idea emerged from a listening session in Franklin County. So that felt really important. We have Mark Edwards, our Franklin County outreach coordinator there. And then we also went with Skowhegan because in Central Maine, there were a ton of different organizations, clubs, municipalities that really showed up for the Trails Bond. And we wanted to make sure we spent a good amount of time out there too. And so I do want to highlight in Skowhegan, the series of strategy meetings that we had, it showed really the diversity of the Trails Bond campaign in that smaller scale too. I would say the leaders of that, we had folks showing up from Main Street Skowhegan, Quarry Road Trails, local ATV clubs, Lake George Regional Park, and Somerset Woods trustees. So there were so many different people from different backgrounds that were part of thinking through what the Trails Bond could mean in their community and how to get out the word. And it was really neat to be a part of. And so in addition to that, we also were thinking about that broader mobilization strategy statewide. So we developed a digital toolkit for supporters. So we had something we could email out to folks that they could repost and share to their networks and their bases. We had bumper stickers, yard signs, we had placards for businesses, and also laminated signs for trailheads. And we both had the option for people to request materials that we could mail to them, but also we stashed materials across the state. Thank you to anyone that hosted materials for us. And so we had all of that going. And then we also wanted to make sure that we were talking about the Trails Bond at events across the state, from the Maine Snowmobile Show to the Common Ground Fair to the Garlic Festival. There was a lot of talk about the Trails Bond everywhere. Josh, can you go to the next slide? All right. And so that was a lot of that strategy took place before the first week of September. I mean, the strategy meetings had to continue afterwards for sure, but we wanted to make sure that we had a lot ready to go for the press conference, which took place in early September. A lot of the cast of characters that were mentioned by Josh earlier, like Jenny from Maine Outdoor Brands, or Al Sweat from the Maine Snowmobile Association. A lot of them were up in Bangor talking about the Trails Bond. All right, next slide. And so I just want to highlight really quickly, we also had digital ads too that were able to reach over 260,000 households. You can see a little, I won't dive too much in the numbers, but we had some fun ads going. The next slide. And we ended up passing the bond. And so it was 55% to 45%. It was the best performing bond out of all the bonds, so we were pretty excited about that. And I also want to take some time to really highlight, we've started to dive into what that win actually means. And Josh, if you go to the next slide. So you can see a map of like where the Trails Bond passed, where it might not have. And something that was really neat to see in Franklin County, for example, the Trails Bond was the only bond that passed out of the county. And then in central Maine, and a lot of the communities that we knew that our leaders were doing a good amount of outreach about the Trails Bond in, the Trails Bond did better than any of the other bonds. And for example, in Mercer, Fairfield, and Madison, the Trails Bond was the only bond that passed. And so it was really just neat how dispersed the campaign was and how many people we had talking about it across the state, but also it mattered a lot. And the work that a lot of these local groups were doing in their own communities went a really, really long way. So next steps, the applications are anticipated to open to apply for funding in January, with applications due June 2025, and we expect the first awards granted in September. So it's moving quickly, which we're really, really excited about. And so the benefits can start really soon. And so we'll see how this first round goes, and we're excited for 3 more years to come as well. And we're also excited to keep being in conversation too about how to ensure that this implementation stage goes well, and that this funding really can be used by groups across the state. So I think that's all we have for now. So we're happy to take questions.
Thank you both so much for that great presentation and for all of the work that you've been a part of, both on the Trails Bond and more broadly. We've got some great questions already lined up, and folks should continue to send those more questions to me and to Maggie. We'll get to as many of them as possible. But before we dive in, this is the part of the program where we always offer a way to continue to take action, to continue your learning, and you can absolutely, it's going to be obvious here, get started planning your trail project and get some guidance. If you have an idea for a new trail or an improvement project, Josh and Bronya are a great resource for getting started. We will share their contact information as well as information about the Trails Bond in the follow-up email. You can reach out, you can engage your community and begin spreading the word about this great opportunity. All right, let's dive in. How can you give us a sense of how projects will be evaluated and selected to receive this funding? Like, can we all help shape that selection process, or are the criteria really already baked in the bond, the what we just voted on itself?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kathleen. I'm happy to answer. Would it be better if I pulled down the question slide and we were all looking at each other?
Yeah,
Or
go
do you-
for it, so we can see each other's faces.
Great, I'll do that. Okay, wonderful. This is a really good question. And the answer is that there are a few things that are in statute that we wanted to pass to ensure in the legislation that this trails bond would be assessed on. A couple of those things include sustainability of the trail, right? We wanted to ensure that any trail project that gets awarded can evidence that it is sustainable and will be around for the long term. Accessibility is another one. So accessibility, you're going to have to evidence that your trail is accessible, and trails will be prioritized based on their accessibility. There were a few things as well that we also knew that the recreational trails program was going to be able to help us with. So they're developing an entire set of evaluation criteria that is going to be made public once it's finalized. And you'll be able to see that if you're applying for questions. That's still in the drafting process, so you can reach out and encourage them to consider certain things. But there are some things that they've learned over many, many years of evaluating the recreational trails program that I think will be really valuable. Bronya, is there anything that you might add to the criteria by which trails are selected, or not so much?
No, I think you covered it.
One thing I might note too, there's this distribution, right, for motorized, non-motorized, and multimodal. The way that's going to work, the recreational trails program is typically 30% motorized, 30% non-motorized, 40% multimodal. So we wanted to make an effort to have a more diverse array of projects with this trails program. But if any of those buckets aren't filled, and what we typically see is that sometimes because motorized trails get funding from other sources, it might be the case that there aren't enough applications to fill the 25% bucket for motorized, just an example. That funding can actually be used for other buckets if there aren't enough applications to fill that bucket. So I wanted to make that clarifying point as well.
Mm-hmm. I also want to add too, I just thought of there was a pretty wide group of people that are as part of the advisory committee for developing the criteria. And you could actually look up online too with the Maine recreational trails program advisory committee. And you can see folks from like all different sectors represented. And so it was a really neat combination and like diversity of people that were coming up with that criteria.
I'm sorry, we're kind of bouncing back and forth here,
I love
Kathleen.
it.
I'm excited about this process. One thing that I forgot to mention that is also in the legislation that I wanted to be sure to highlight is that the projects that get selected must demonstrate support from entities either such as state agencies, municipalities, nonprofits, trail user groups, businesses, or the public. So the trails projects that are submitted are specifically going to be graded on whether they have public support. So I think it's just another example of the way in which this will be distributed in a way that prioritizes local perspectives. And that was really the whole intention of this project, is that it's going to be oriented through the recreational trails program, but it's all going to be conducted and executed by local trails organizations.
You may have already said this, but I need to hear it again. Who is making that selection then? Is it that, Bronya, you described that great group of people who established the criteria. Are they the ones who determine whether projects meet the criteria, or who decides who's getting money?
Yeah, I can start, and then Josh, fill in if I'm missing anything. But from my understanding, so Doug Beck, he's the main administrator for the Bureau of Parks and Lands of this trail funding. And so, but to make that selection, he does have the help of the advisory committee to pick projects.
Right.
Is that right, Josh? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So the recreational trails program basically has a board of people that are selected to serve as applicant analysts. So they look at all the applications that come in and then score them collectively as an advisory group. And then the projects that score the highest are the ones that are awarded.
Is there anything in that list of criteria about how a trail is actually built, like machine-made trails versus, shovels and people power. How do we think about that sort of impact of trail development?
Yeah, that's a good question. There isn't anything specifying the way in which the trail should be conducted other than the sustainability standard associated with it. So it has to be evidenced to be sustainable. It also is worth noting that there is a cap set at $250,000 per project to ensure that these projects are distributed around the state. So a $250,000 project might sound like a lot, but in actuality, you would probably need to string together a couple of $250,000 projects to put together a really big trail development. So the current recreational trail program cap is $100,000. So it's a big boost up from $100,000, but it's not, to the scale of like clear cutting, massive lanes that would be equivalent to road building.
And you said something about a match as well. Can you remind me what the percentage is, but also what are the options for applicants to meet that match or come up with that match?
Yeah, so there's a couple different options, and it's a 10% match. Typically, it's a 20% match for local entities, but we did reduce that after talking to some of our community members who highlighted that for some of these groups that are applying, they may be resource limited and not be able to procure a 20% match. And if that's the case, we don't want that to prevent them from actually applying for a project. So 10% can either be a direct cash contribution. So if you're applying for a $250,000 project, that would look like tacking on an additional $25,000 so that the total value of the project would be $275,000. And that's a value, right? It adds some extra money to the project. The other thing you can do though is in-kind project match. And in-kind would look like donating a certain amount of volunteer hours to go towards trail construction or maintenance, or donating equipment and materials to be used for trails construction. And the RTP program basically assesses the value of volunteer hours and or equipment, and then we'll determine at what point you've met the 10% match. So yet another way in which local organizations can, if they don't have the capital to expend, could expend volunteer hours or the existing infrastructure they have and typically use to build trails.
You guys thought of so many things. Thank you. I really appreciate that. So you probably thought of this too, which is some organizations have more resources, have grant writers on staff, have people who know sort of how this works. Do they have an advantage, or are there ways to sort of make sure that funding is going to areas, like geographic areas, but also just kinds of organizations that might have fewer resources and greater needs?
I'm happy to jump in. Basically, we tried to make sure that the application process was as least burdensome as possible. There are certain things that you have to evidence, but we didn't want it to be the case that it was so bureaucratic that people wouldn't be excited about or have the capacity to put projects forward. I would also say that the Recreational Trails Program is a very well-known program and has been operating in the state for a really long time. And Doug has been making a ton of tweaks over time to ensure that these trails projects are accessible and the funding is accessible for a wide array of folks. So I think that it is a pretty accessible program. It might be the case that some larger trails groups that already have ideas will have an edge, but there's a lot of funding available, right? A $250,000 cap means that there are 28 projects that could be assigned at the $250,000 cap in just 1 year, right? And then 28 projects the next year, and then 28 projects the next year. And that's if each project is a $250,000 project, which we don't anticipate. There will be some smaller ones as well. So I think you're going to see a broad distribution of projects throughout the state. And the applying entities can be anything ranging from a nonprofit to a trail group to a municipality. So I'd like to think that we've thought about the administrative support to make sure that happens. And that's my final note. Most of the $30 million goes directly to trails maintenance and building, and that was intended. But there is 3% of the bond that is used for application support and administrative purposes by the Bureau of Parks and Lands. So, they can apply 3% of the $30 million to support groups in applying and provide some planning support for groups if there's needs for that capacity. And then an additional 1% of the $30 million can be used exclusively for planning projects. So primarily we want the money to go directly to trail building and maintenance, but there is some extent to which planning can be a part of it.
Mm-hmm. I'll just add too, and Kathleen, I think that was such an important question and something that's been on our minds a lot. And I think that's a big reason too for why we chose to do like prioritize local organizing and ensuring that we're talking about the Trails Bond across the state and making sure that like early on groups across the state and that might not usually be able to react as quickly to something like this because they don't have a grant writer on staff, for example, like they have ample time to prepare and know this is coming. And also I think our work is cut out for us over the next bit to make sure that we're able to ensure that, you know, all 520 of the organizations and businesses and municipalities that were really excited about this bond are looped in about, you know, when they can officially apply and how to go about doing so. And also to make sure that we're able to broadcast learnings from the first round so that people in the second round can learn from it too.
Such a good point, Bronya. And I just want to evidence, yeah, like sometimes I think in Maine, we've done so much recently, and that's fantastic. But advocacy and passing legislation is just as important as implementation. And so our work is not over on the Trails Bond. We will continue to support groups to apply. And they do have that January to June window, which is a 6-month window to apply for this program with all of the understanding of what the application requirements are. So we'll certainly be working hard to ensure that any trails group with a good maintenance or building project will be able to apply for funding.
There are so many really specific questions and really big picture questions that are coming up in the chat. And I just want to acknowledge how exciting that is, that there are a lot of folks on this call right now who I can tell have their draft application up and they are taking notes. So this is really great news. And for all of you who have specific questions, we've still got time, and we're gonna ask more of those. But just want to let you know that there is draft guidance already in development, and really want to thank Andy Cutco, who's the director of the Bureau of Parks and Lands, who's on this call and sending me lots of good tips in the chat. Andy, you are amazing. Thank you so much. And he's pointing out too that the BPL staff are absolutely willing and ready to help with applications. So to answer questions, to help connect you, we're gonna share Josh and Bronya's information, but we will also share that state level connection point in the follow-up email because this is going to be a collaborative process. And Bronya, you mentioned this, and I really want to spend some time talking today about that work of building the broad support, because it led to the success of the bond. We know we're going to need it for the success of the program, and for the success of our movement writ large, right? So could you talk a little bit more about how you sort of balance that work of building a broad coalition, elevating voices that people might say, wait, did you say that those guys were involved in this? But also knowing that maybe there are some usual suspects who weren't on that slide of partners, that, you know, how'd you decide whose voices to amplify and whose voices maybe to know you couldn't move forward without, but weren't going to be in the headline?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think something that really helped like create and balance that dynamic was, I think that something really, really neat that the Trails Bond highlighted was a lot of the energy around trail networks. So it's not just like a trails project that one organization is working on, it's trails projects that multiple different types of groups rely on each other for. So I think like a good example of that would be the Skowhegan Master Plan. So there's a proposed plan for the development of around like 60 miles of trails in the Skowhegan area. That would lead to the development of better like walking paths and like paths through the woods and mountain biking trails. And so, and then also like ATVing trails. So it thinks about like a lot of different trails users. And then also because of that, like the public health group in the area was pretty interested in the Master Trails Plan and the Trails Bond. So I think like when we started to especially think about trails as networks, and like the more one-on-one conversations that I had in the Skowhegan area, like for example, I would talk to some groups, they're like, oh, we really, if we're gonna have a strategy session here, we really need groups in Oakland and Waterville here because like we all depend on each other for our longer term vision. And I think that was something that was really, really cool. And I think allowed it to be a campaign that held a lot of voices.
Totally. I would just note too that the Natural Resources Council of Maine and our partners that work regularly at the State House were able to pull in a lot of voices and introduce them to the legislative process for the first time because that's kind of our area of expertise. But then trail builders were joining our coalition that were telling us about things that we certainly did not know about that were really valuable for legislators to hear, or that were really valuable for the general public to hear. And I think it's important to note that while we were certainly perhaps instigators and organizers along with a whole bunch of other folks, people were coming out of the woodwork to to try to get more funding for trails, right? This is a really voluntary thing. So in terms of, selecting voices to amplify, I think I would more so frame it as voices were amplified, throughout the campaign because a lot of people wanted to step up and advocate for trails in their given community. So I think that was a really beautiful process to watch happen. And it really originated from like we got 12 to 25 sign-ons, and that took quite a bit to kind of get people familiar. And then all of a sudden, this sign-on letter is taking off, and we have over 500 entities that range from businesses to municipalities to trails groups to the ATV Trail Riders of Maine. It became diverse very quickly, which was cool to see. Also, really awesome that Andy Cutco is on the call, and he's the director of the Bureau of Parks and Lands, which is the entity overseeing this process of distributing funding through the Trails Bond. So please do hop on, Andy, and provide any insights at any point in our Q&A here, because you know it more than we do.
Yeah, thank you, Josh, also for adding that. And I think like I just want to stress again what Josh just said about it. The framing of it wasn't necessarily that we were selecting certain voices. It was just like who took ownership and leadership and came out of the woodwork. And honestly, it was really interesting. Like the last, I would say, month or so, I anticipated I would need to do a lot of just like nagging, and I don't know, I anticipated that a lot more of my work would be cut out for the last month. But I think that it's been awesome to see how many people just like on their own of like, yep, now I have everything I need and I am gonna just do all this outreach in my own community. And also it was just really neat too to see and like go through like who did on their own just decide to talk about the Trails Bond and broadcasted it to their base. So yeah.
Hey folks,
Welcome,
I'll
Andy.
jump in. This is Andy Cutco. I'm the director of the Bureau of Parks and Lands, and I see we've got a couple other staffers on the call. You guys have nailed it. Well done, and great job at getting this thing off the ground and getting folks mobilized and collaborating with motorized and non-motorized communities across the state. So we're thrilled to have the money in place. And I don't have a whole lot to add other than we're really excited to get this money out on the ground and in the hands of folks who are doing great work across the state. There were a few questions about the specific process and criteria, and I'll let you know that Doug Beck, who is the director of the Bureau's Community Grants and Recreation Program, has been working with folks to develop a guidance document that is not yet finalized. So if folks would like to see it and review it and have some input, email doug.beck@maine.gov. He would have liked to be here today, but had another commitment. And we look forward to seeing those comments and finalizing that document in the next few weeks. So thanks again for everyone for getting this thing off the ground. We are really, really excited to be moving forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Andy. And I see that Maggie in the chat is saying that she'll include Doug's email in the follow-up, and just want to make sure that our emails are also included. There's a lot of people that have worked on this and have a lot of great insight and can support you if you are seeking to fill out an application or even think about what trail project might be most appropriate for your community. So we'd love to continue working with you on that front.
I love that. I love when the collaboration is showing in real time. Thank you. Bronya, I really appreciated that, like sort of thinking about how broad the group was. And that is an incredible strength. It can also sometimes be a challenge, right? And I'm curious about whether, sort of what came up as particularly around shared use of trails. And I know there was some conversation about motorized and non-motorized users, and where did people maybe come together? Where did people sort of agree to disagree? What are we buckling in for and getting the popcorn ready to to watch the next round of conversations? Tell us.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And nothing is jumping too much at the top of my head in terms of like what we should be buckling up for. I felt like it was like within the coalition spaces that I was in and like the community spaces, I felt like people were pretty broadly like supportive of each other's needs. And I think that, for example, it'd be really interesting talking to some people from various land trusts that didn't usually have motorized trails and were like, there's certain trails it feels important for us to not have this, but we also understand that this is how a lot of people in our community get outside. And like, I don't know, I think that it was neat to have different conversations with people. For example, like how for some people, I was talking to one of our members in the Skowhegan area, and she was reflecting over how she was not sure for a while about ATVs, but eventually, because she came from more of a hiking background, and but eventually when her mom was pretty sick, the way that she was able to get outside was on an ATV and to like feel her, like the wind in her hair. And I don't know, it was just a really cool, I think that this opportunity provided just a lot of neat conversations about like however people need to get outside is so important. And of course, there's like with multi-use trails, there's definitely safety considerations and whatnot. But I think that I was like surprised by again and again how many people were like generally just like wanted as many people as possible to get outside. And of course, it's going to be a balance of where it goes. But I do think it does help that it is allocated in the ways that it is with the bond.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, Josh, anything that's coming to mind for you?
Yeah, I'd say a few things. One, if we did not have a diverse coalition, this would not have passed. And I just want to be very clear about that. I mean, the extent to which it passed in the Senate and House was remarkable. And it's not often the case that you see ATV groups working with snowmobile groups. You don't often see those two groups working with environmental groups. It's like, so the fact that we were able to come together and cross ideological and political lines was, I think, a true testament to the value of the organizing we did. And I would also note that people enjoy the outdoors in many different ways and use trails both for utility and for recreation. And the most sustainable and least intrusive way to engage with the outdoors in Maine is by being on a well-built trail. And as we're seeing trails eroding, both on hiking trails, on ATV trails, snowmobile trails, biking trails, I mean, the best thing that we can do is ensure that those trail networks are actually up to snuff and are sustainable so that we aren't seeing uses of any type of engagement that is more deleterious to the environment.
I feel like I want to push on that just because it's so interesting and there's something, I don't know if it's counterintuitive, but that whole piece of like a well-built trail is better for the environment than like just say that piece a bit again and explain it to me.
Man, I wish that Steve Kasicek was on the call here, who's a phenomenal trail builder with the Outdoor Sports Institute. But I, before this campaign, did not give enough appreciation for the process of building a trail. I think that a lot of us might be in the boat of like, well, trails just exist. They kind of existed before people had walking paths and they just kind of came to be. But it actually put a ton of effort goes into creating trails and maintaining trails. And yeah, if we don't have a well-built trail network and system, then people will engage with our environment in a way that is more diverse and more ultimately impactful, right? So we want trails to be a space where people are able to be connected to their community, connected to the outdoors, and interacting with the outdoors in the most sustainable and gratitude-oriented way possible. And Steve can just speak really effectively to how you can build a trail to ensure those types of communal connections and interactions, so you're seeing the most beautiful view sheds while also avoiding some really ecologically sensitive areas. I mean, there's a lot that goes into trail building and planning. And I think that this $30 million infusion into trail building and planning is only going to evidence that it's something we need to continue to fund in the future. So I really hope that that's a big outcome from this trails bond.
I know that Maggie and I are doing the mind meld thing right now and thinking, oh, that sounds like a future lunch and learn program, because boy, do I want to hear all of those details too. And maybe we can even pull the curtain back and give some tips to folks who are thinking about how to make their application as strong as possible and share that information. I know there is a network of folks who know so much about this that is not new to it all. But for those of you who are more like me, like realizing in real time, oh gosh, this is a whole thing. We can help amplify that and get that information. Let's see, what else have we got here? With such incredible support, I have to ask, was there pushback? Did you talk to people who said, this is a crazy idea, this is an unnecessary idea? How did you manage it? I think a lot of us are right now thinking, how do we have conversations with people who disagree with us? So what'd you learn?
Do you want to take that one, Bronya, or do you want me to kick it off? And
I can start because I'm actually really curious, Josh, with what you might say with working on like the majority of the campaign. Because I mostly jumped in April, but I feel like I was surprised within the coming months, actually, like the primary pushback I would hear, one was actually concern about the funding going to motorized uses from quite a few people. And I think that a lot of the conversation over the last few minutes has sort of addressed like how we navigated that, which is like, we think it's important that this and crucial that this funding goes to all sorts of trail uses. And we would never have this funding if we didn't work in a broad coalition and uplift different trail uses. And I think too, the other pushback would be some people just like vote down bonds usually and don't feel comfortable with bonds. So and that's sort of I mean, we could talk about like the economic benefits and how this will certainly pay off, but yeah, that is a little bit of a harder one.
yeah, I would agree. I think that like there was reticence around spending and investing in trails as a concept. And we asked for $30 million from the get-go. That was the original draft of the bond. And typically, for those of you familiar with the legislature, you ask for more and you get quite a bit less. So I think it was a really incredible thing to be able to reaffirm that the economic investment in trails has incredible return on that investment. And I just want to highlight too that Maine is growing for the first time in a long time. And people are moving here because of the incredible access to the outdoors that we have. And the Maine outdoor recreation economy is growing faster than Maine's economy at large. And so continuing to invest in trails as a mechanism by which to get people into the outdoors and to say, this is an awesome state. This is one way that you can utilize your time here. We can continue to grow the businesses that depend on our outdoor recreation economy. And we continue to attract young folks that are looking for opportunities to get outside. I mean, I think the return on investment is going to be incredible. And I think that's the message we were able to drive home with this diverse coalition was 30 million sounds like a lot. It's actually just a start. And it's going to lead to a ton of growth in Maine's outdoor recreation industry. So, but there was a lot of skepticism to start. So I think a big testament to the organizing effort to overcome that skepticism.
You don't have to convince this group how valuable this bond and this work is going to be. And thank you for walking us through all of it. There's so much interest. I'm hoping we can just end with that sort of, for the folks out there who maybe need that sort of metric at the end of it. What are we talking about in terms of trail maintenance jobs or job opportunities? What should we expect to see? Is there a chance that all those young people moving to Maine or not moving away from Maine are going to say, I'm going to get a job building trails? What do you think?
I'm going to say infinite jobs, infinite money, infinite fun is what's going to result from this trails bond. I don't know entirely. It will be exciting to see how this plays out, but I do think that the timing aligns really well. We mentioned the pandemic being a factor that really drove people to explore outdoor areas. Now that Maine has kind of been put on the map in some ways in terms of a place that you can go and get outside, when some of the more dense areas are a little bit, people are being more cautious around. I mean, I think this is really going to build on some of that leverage that we were able to gain by highlighting that Maine is a really beautiful place to come and recreate in. And we want that recreation to be sustainable. And I think this Trails Bond ensures that it is going to be sustainable. And so, yeah, we'll see what it results in. But I think it's a really, really fast growing part of our economy and our culture. And this is going to facilitate that at the right time.
All right, infinite jobs, infinite fun. You heard it here first, and you will hear a lot more of it. Josh and Bronya, thank you just enormously for the work you've done and for sharing it with us today. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I think I might have smiled more in this last hour with you all than I have in a couple days, so I appreciate it. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Get out there and enjoy the well-built trails that are in your community already, and do a little bit of dreaming about what you're going to build next, because there is an opportunity. We've got a bond for that. Thank you. Thank you. We will see you again soon.